Hello everybody and welcome back to the Eureka Centre here in UCC. And what I now want to talk about is to try to explain what are learning outcomes. Now, if we want to get a definition of learning outcomes, we go to the literature. So Morse and Murray, two great educators in Scotland, said statements of what students should know and be able to do as a result of learning. European Qualifications Framework, similar definition. The University of New South Wales in Australia, similar definition. So as you can see, there are various definitions given in the literature, and they're all basically saying the same thing. So the important thing to note is that the definition of learning outcomes is very clearly defined in the literature. So a good working definition of what a learning outcome is that they are statements of what a student should know, understand, and be able to demonstrate when they've completed this process of learning. Now, you can write a learning outcome for an individual lecture, for a module or a short course, for, say, a workshop, or for an entire 4-year program. We'll be looking at how to write learning outcomes in this series. Now, one important thing about learning outcomes is that they should not be some just vague series of statements. They shouldn't be just like a wish list. They have to be embedded into teaching and learning. Learning outcomes always have to be simply and clearly described, and every time you write a learning outcome, you should have one question in the back of your mind, and that is, how am I going to assess this learning outcome? That's vitally important. So, the first thing I want to do is to distinguish between aims, objectives, and learning outcomes, because very often there is confusion in these aims. So, aims are broad general statements of what the teacher intends to cover. So, for example, you might be teaching organic chemistry, I'm just picking one of my own subjects, to give students an introduction to this whole area of organic chemistry. That might take you an entire year of teaching students. The word aim, by the way, in some countries like the United States is often called a goal. So aims are broad, general statements, whereas objectives are more specific areas. So if you think about an aim might be to lose weight, and if you lost 1 kilo a week would be your objective. And if you were to travel to Australia, your first objective might be to get to a country in the Middle East before getting a connecting flight. Something like that. So objectives do tend to be more specific, in other words, a shorter time period. So giving examples of objectives here, you can see some on the screen, and I want you to note the language, to give students an appreciation of something, to give students an understanding of something, to make sure students know something, to make students familiar with. So these are the language of aims and objectives that we use. So aims long-term, objectives short-term. So to help you remember, in that slide I've summarized the language that we use when writing aims and objectives. Now we still have to write aims and objectives, but we must now write learning outcomes as well. And it's important to realize that we use different language for learning outcomes. So there are some examples of aims there in that slide. Giving students an introduction to theories and practice, giving students an understanding, an appreciation, developing knowledge, and so on. Right. Now, one important distinction between aims and objectives and learning outcomes. If you look here on the left of the screen, we're emphasizing the teacher-centered approach to teaching and learning. And that is where aims and objectives are focused. The teacher writes the aims, the teacher writes the objectives, using words like know, understand, and be familiar with. And up to Bologna in 1999, as we discussed in the first talk in this series, everything was written in terms of aims and objectives. Learning outcomes put the emphasis on what the students can do on completion of a module or a course or a lecture or whatever. And when you put the emphasis on the student, this is often referred to as the student-centered approach to teaching and learning, as distinct from the teacher-centered approach to teaching and learning. And whenever we write learning outcomes, we must always use an active verb. Whenever we write learning outcomes, we must always use an active verb. And I'll be coming back to that important statement when we look at the lecture on writing learning outcomes and giving you lots of examples. So it's not a question of learning outcomes replacing the aims and objectives. We still need aims and objectives written. We still need dedicated and inspirational teachers. All that learning outcomes are doing is they're helping to set up this dynamic equilibrium between the teacher-centered approach and the student-centered approach. You cannot separate one from the other. They are inextricably linked, as I will show you in subsequent lectures. So in summary, therefore, learning outcomes are statements of what a student should know, understand, and be able to demonstrate after completion of the process of learning. Aims are broad general statements. Objectives are more specific statements. And you have this dynamic equilibrium set up between the teacher-centered approach and the student-centered approach, which we will be more developed as we go through this series. So thank you all very much for your kind attention.